This photo looks innocent, but experts found a dark detail no one had seen before. The daguerreotype arrived at the Smithsonian's National Museum of African American History and Culture on a humid morning in June 2024. Dr. Michael Chen, head of the Photographic Conservation Department, carefully removed it from its archival housing and placed it under the specialized lighting of his examination table. The image showed a typical Southern family portrait from 1858. A wealthy South Carolina planter family posed in their garden, surrounded by manicured hedges and flowering plants. Michael had been restoring 19th century photographs for 12 years, and he'd developed an efficient system for assessing condition and planning treatment. This particular daguerreotype was in remarkably good shape for its age. Minimal tarnishing, no major scratches, just some light oxidation around the silver plate's edges. The donor, a historical society in Charleston, had submitted it as part of a larger collection documenting antebellum Southern life. The composition was carefully arranged. The father stood in the center wearing a dark suit, his hand resting on an ornate garden chair where his wife sat, in an elaborate dress with multiple layers of silk and lace. 2 teenage children flanked their parents, a boy in formal attire and a girl in a pristine white gown. To the right of the frame, partially out of the main focal area, stood a young black girl, perhaps 7 years old, wearing a simple cotton dress that reached her ankles. Michael noted her presence in his initial assessment. It wasn't unusual to find enslaved people in the backgrounds or edges of family portraits from this era. Sometimes they were included deliberately as displays of wealth. Other times they simply happened to be present when the photograph was taken. This girl appeared to have been positioned intentionally, standing quietly with her hands clasped in front of her, her expression carefully neutral. He began the standard documentation process, photographing the daguerreotype from multiple angles before beginning the actual restoration work. The high-resolution digital camera captured every detail of the silver surface, creating files that would allow him to work with extreme precision. As the images uploaded to his computer, Michael prepared his workspace for the delicate cleaning process that would come next, unaware that those digital files contained a discovery that would change everything he thought he knew about this seemingly ordinary portrait. Michael spent the afternoon carefully cleaning the daguerreotype surface, using specialized solutions and gentle techniques developed specifically for these fragile, silver-based images. The process was meditative, requiring absolute focus and steady hands. As the tarnish and accumulated grime of 166 years dissolved away, the image grew clearer, details emerging that had been obscured by time and chemical degradation. By late afternoon, he'd completed the initial cleaning and returned the daguerreotype to its climate-controlled storage. Now came the digital restoration phase, working with high-resolution scans to further enhance details, correct color shifts caused by aging, and document the image's condition. Michael opened the files on his large format monitor and began his systematic examination, working section by section across the photograph. He started with the parents, enhancing facial details, noting the quality of their clothing, documenting the jewelry visible on the mother. Then he moved to the children, examining their formal attire and stiff poses. Finally, he reached the section containing the young black girl standing at the edge of the frame. Michael zoomed in on her face first. She was quite young, with delicate features and large eyes that stared somewhere beyond the camera, not quite meeting its gaze. Her expression was difficult to read, not quite blank, but carefully controlled in a way that seemed unnatural for a child. Her hair was pulled back tightly under a simple cloth head wrap. The cotton dress she wore was plain, unadorned, a stark contrast to the elaborate clothing of the white family members. As Michael continued enhancing the image, adjusting contrast and sharpness, he noticed something odd about the hem of her dress. The fabric appeared slightly rumpled near her ankles, creating shadows that seemed inconsistent with the rest of the photograph's lighting. He increased the magnification further, focusing specifically on that area. That's when he saw it, or rather, saw the suggestion of something. A thin line darker than the fabric surrounding it, visible just above where her bare feet touched the ground. Michael leaned closer to his monitor, his pulse quickening. He adjusted the enhancement settings, increasing contrast and sharpening details. The line became clearer, a thin band encircling her ankle, partially hidden by the dress hem and the shadows it cast. Michael sat back, his mind racing. Could it be what he thought it was? Michael spent the next hour working exclusively on that section of the image, applying every enhancement technique he knew. He adjusted brightness, contrast, and sharpness. He used edge detection algorithms to emphasize subtle variations in the photograph's tonal values. He applied noise reduction filters to eliminate digital artifacts while preserving genuine details. Slowly, painstakingly, the truth emerged from pixels that had held their secret for more than a century and a half. It was definitely a chain. A thin metal chain encircled the girl's right ankle, visible in the narrow gap between the hem of her dress and the ground. The dress had been long enough to nearly conceal it, perhaps deliberately, perhaps accidentally, but the way she stood, with her weight shifted slightly, had created just enough space for the camera to capture its presence. The chain appeared delicate, almost decorative, but Michael had no doubt about its purpose. His hands trembled as he continued examining the image. Could he see where the chain led? He expanded his enhancement to include more of the surrounding area, looking for any indication of what the chain was attached to. The image quality degraded as he moved away from the girl herself. The photographer's focus had been on the family, rendering the edges of the frame slightly softer. But there, barely visible in the enhanced scan, he could make out what looked like a stake or post driven into the ground about 3 feet from where she stood, hidden behind a garden shrub. Michael needed confirmation, needed someone else to verify what he was seeing before he could trust his own interpretation. He called Dr. Sarah Okoye, the museum's chief historian specializing in slavery in the antebellum South. Sarah had collaborated with the conservation department on numerous projects, and Michael trusted her expertise and judgment. "Sarah, I need you to come to the lab," he said when she answered. "I'm working on an 1858 daguerreotype from South Carolina, and I found something that I think you need to see immediately." "How immediately?" Sarah's voice carried curiosity mixed with concern. She knew Michael well enough to recognize when something significant had emerged from his work. "Right now, if possible. Sarah, I think I've found evidence of a child being chained during a family portrait session." There was a brief silence. "I'll be there in 5 minutes." Michael used those 5 minutes to prepare additional enhanced images, creating a series that would clearly show what he'd discovered. Sarah arrived carrying her tablet and a notebook, her expression already serious. Michael had worked with her long enough to know that she approached historical evidence with both scholarly rigor and deep emotional investment. She never forgot that the documents and images they studied represented real people who had suffered real trauma. "Show me," she said without preamble. Michael pulled up the full image first, giving her context. Standard wealthy family portrait, 1858, somewhere near Charleston. Father, mother, 2 teenage children. And here, he pointed to the girl at the edge of the frame. This young girl, probably enslaved given the period, location, and her positioning in the photograph. Sarah studied the image carefully, her eyes moving across every detail. She's very young, 7, maybe 8 years old, positioned to be visible but not prominent, common enough for the era. Some families included enslaved children in portraits, others didn't. "What am I looking for?" Michael zoomed in on the girl's lower dress and ankles, showing the sequence of enhanced images he'd created. "Look at her right ankle, just above where her foot touches the ground." Sarah leaned close to the monitor, her eyes narrowing as she focused on the area Michael indicated. He watched her face as comprehension dawned, saw the moment she recognized what she was seeing. Her expression shifted from curiosity to shock, to barely controlled anger. "That's a chain," she said quietly. "A metal chain around her ankle." "Yes, and if you look here," Michael pointed to the enhanced image showing the area beyond the girl, "you can just barely make out what looks like a stake or post. I think she was chained to it with enough length to stand in position for the photograph, but not enough to move freely." Sarah sat down heavily in the chair beside Michael's workstation. "I've studied slavery for 15 years. I've read countless slave narratives, examined thousands of documents, visited dozens of plantation sites. I knew intellectually that children were restrained, controlled, subjected to violence. But seeing actual photographic evidence of a child chained during what's meant to be a genteel family portrait, that's different. That makes it visceral in a way that written records don't." She took a breath, collecting herself, shifting back into professional mode. "We need to document this thoroughly. Can you create a full series of enhanced images showing the chain from multiple angles? And we need to research the photograph's provenance, who these people were, where exactly this was taken, any records that might identify this child." Over the next week, Michael created an extensive series of enhanced images, each one revealing additional details about the chain and the girl's situation. Using advanced computational photography techniques, he managed to extract remarkable clarity from the 166-year-old daguerreotype. The chain itself appeared to be iron, thin but strong, the kind of restraint that would allow limited movement while preventing any possibility of running away. He could see where it encircled her ankle, not loosely, but fitted closely enough to prevent removal. Sarah, meanwhile, dove into researching the photograph's provenance. The Charleston Historical Society had provided basic documentation. The image had been donated in 1965 by the estate of Margaret Thornton, whose family papers indicated it showed her great-grandparents, Robert and Catherine Thornton, with their children James and Elizabeth, at their plantation called Fairview, located about 20 miles inland from Charleston. Sarah searched through digitized records, looking for anything related to the Thornton family and Fairview plantation. The 1860 census listed Robert Thornton as owning 62 enslaved people, a substantial number indicating significant wealth. The slave schedule for that year listed them only by age and gender, providing no names. But Sarah noted several entries for children. Female, 6 years. Female, 8 years. Female, 9 years. Male, 7 years. She contacted the South Carolina Historical Society, explaining her research and asking about any surviving Thornton family papers. The response came 3 days later. Yes, they had a small collection of Thornton documents donated in the 1980s, including several plantation account books and some personal correspondence. Sarah drove to Charleston the following Monday, spending 2 days in the archives examining everything the Thorntons had left behind. The account books were revealing in their casual cruelty. Lists of enslaved people with their assigned tasks, medical expenses for treating injuries, purchases of restraints and punishment implements, documented alongside expenses for furniture and fine wines. In an account book dated 1856-1860, Sarah found a section listing household servants that included several children. One entry made her pause. Lucy, age 7, house servant and children's attendant. Special management required. Special management required. The euphemistic language sent chills down Sarah's spine. She photographed every page, noting anything that might relate to the girl in the photograph. In a letter from Catherine Thornton to her sister, dated July 1858, right around when the photograph appeared to have been taken, she found a passage that provided devastating context. Sarah returned to Washington with copies of everything she'd found. She and Michael spent an afternoon reviewing the documents together, cross-referencing the historical records with what the photograph revealed. The letter from Catherine Thornton was particularly illuminating, though its casual tone made the content even more disturbing. Robert has engaged Mr. Harrison, the daguerreotypist, to come to Fairview next month to make our family portrait, Catherine had written to her sister. I'm quite looking forward to it, though the preparations are exhausting. Robert insists everything must be perfect, the garden trimmed just so, our finest clothing pressed, the children properly instructed on maintaining stillness during the exposure. We have had some difficulty with little Lucy, one of the house servants. She's prone to wandering and has twice run off into the woods, requiring hours to locate her. Robert determined that restraints would be necessary to ensure she remained in place during the photography session. I confess the sight troubles me somewhat. She is quite young. But Robert assures me this is common practice and necessary for maintaining proper discipline. The chain is thin and not overly burdensome, and Lucy has learned to stand quietly. Mr. Harrison will position her at the edge of the frame, where the restraint should not be visible in the final image. Sarah read the passage aloud to Michael, her voice tight with controlled emotion. Should not be visible. They knew she was chained, they planned for it, and they specifically positioned her and dressed her in a way intended to hide the chain from the camera. But they miscalculated slightly, Michael said, looking at his enhanced images. The dress was long enough to mostly conceal the chain, but not quite long enough to hide it completely. And they didn't account for digital enhancement technology that wouldn't exist for another 150 years. They now had a name, Lucy, age 7 in 1858. Designated as a house servant and children's attendant, which likely meant she was expected to help care for the Thornton children, despite being a child herself, and she had tried to run away, twice before being chained for the photograph. Sarah continued researching, determined to find out as much as possible about Lucy's life. The account books revealed some details. Lucy was listed as the daughter of a woman named Bess, age 29, who worked as a cook. No father was named. Medical expenses appeared occasionally. Treatment for Lucy, foot injury, $2. Salve for Lucy, skin irritation from restraints, $150. The casual documentation of skin irritation from restraints appeared in multiple entries over the years, 1857, 1860. Lucy hadn't been chained just for the photograph. The restraints were a regular part of her life, used frequently enough to cause recurring injury that required medical treatment. Sarah expanded her research to understand the broader context of restraining enslaved children. She consulted with other historians, reviewed slave narratives and testimonies collected after emancipation, and examined medical records from the period. What she discovered was that Lucy's situation, while shocking, was far from unique. Many slave narratives mentioned children being restrained, chained, or confined. Frederick Douglass had written about seeing enslaved children tied up as punishment. Harriet Jacobs described children being locked in outbuildings. Medical journals from the period contained references to treating injuries caused by restraints on young slaves, but these were mostly textual references, descriptions in words. The Thornton photograph provided rare visual evidence, a child literally chained during what was meant to be a display of Southern gentility and civilization. Sarah found a particularly relevant passage in the narrative of a formerly enslaved woman named Martha, who had been interviewed by the Works Progress Administration in the 1930s. Martha described her childhood in South Carolina. I was about 7 when they started chaining me at night so I wouldn't run. During the day, too, sometimes, when there was company or important doings. Master didn't want us children running around free when white folks was visiting. Made us stand quiet, chained to posts or rails, till we learned to stay still without the chain. Some children learned quick. I never did learn, so I wore that chain till freedom came. The parallel to Lucy's situation was striking. Chains used to train children into stillness and obedience, used especially during social occasions, when the presence of enslaved people needed to be controlled but their visibility minimized. The Thornton photograph captured exactly this practice. Lucy positioned to be visible but marginal, her presence acknowledged but diminished, her restraint hidden but real. Sarah contacted Martha's descendants. The WPA interviews included family information and discovered that Martha's great-great-granddaughter lived in Charleston. They arranged to meet, and Sarah shared the enhanced photograph of Lucy. Martha's descendant looked at the image for a long time before speaking. My grandmother told us stories about her grandmother, Martha, she said quietly, about being chained as a child. I always wondered if maybe the stories were exaggerated, you know? Not because I doubted her, but because it was so hard to imagine anyone doing that to a 7-year-old. But here's proof. Here's a picture showing it actually happened. It makes those stories real in a different way. As Sarah and Michael prepared to publish their findings, they debated how to present the discovery. The image was undeniably powerful and undeniably disturbing. Some colleagues suggested limiting its circulation, arguing that it was too graphic, too traumatic, especially for descendants of enslaved people who might encounter it. Others insisted it needed to be widely shared, that the truth about slavery's cruelty, especially toward children, needed to be confronted, not hidden. They ultimately decided on a comprehensive approach, a scholarly article detailing their research and analysis, accompanied by a public exhibition that would provide full context and handle the material with appropriate sensitivity. The exhibition would include content warnings, would present the photograph alongside Lucy's story as far as they'd been able to reconstruct it, and would connect her individual experience to the broader system of violence and control that defined slavery. The article was published in the Journal of American History in October 2024. Within days, it had been downloaded thousands of times, shared across academic networks, and picked up by mainstream news outlets. The headline varied by publication, but the message was consistent. Hidden Chain reveals child's restraint in 1858, portrait, or digital restoration exposes slavery's violence against children, or photographs secret. 7-year-old girl was chained during family portrait. The response was immediate and overwhelming. The museum's website, which hosted high-resolution images and extensive documentation, received over 1 million visitors in the first week. Social media erupted with reactions ranging from shock and grief to anger and calls for greater historical honesty about slavery's impact on children. Some responses focused on the technical achievement of the discovery, marveling at how modern technology could reveal details invisible to 19th century viewers. Photography experts analyzed how the chain had remained hidden for so long. The combination of the dress length, shadow placement, and the daguerreotype's tonal range had created a near-perfect concealment that only extreme digital enhancement could penetrate. But most responses focused on the human story, on Lucy, a 7-year-old child who had tried twice to run away and been chained as punishment and control. Teachers shared the story with students, using it to make slavery's reality visceral and immediate. Activists cited it as evidence of historical trauma that continued to impact Black communities. Descendants of enslaved people expressed both pain at seeing such explicit evidence of their ancestors' suffering and gratitude that the truth was finally being acknowledged. 3 months after the article's publication, Sarah received an email that changed the trajectory of her research. A woman named Jennifer Coleman had seen the story and believed Lucy might be her ancestor. Jennifer's family oral history included stories about a Lucy who had been enslaved near Charleston, who bore scars on her ankles from childhood restraints, and who had eventually escaped to freedom during the Civil War. Sarah and Jennifer arranged to meet in Charleston, both bringing their documentation. Jennifer had her family Bible with genealogical records going back 5 generations, several photographs from the late 19th and early 20th centuries, and detailed stories passed down through her family. Sarah had her research on the Thornton plantation, the account books listing Lucy, and of course the enhanced photograph. They spread everything across a table in the South Carolina Historical Society's research room and began comparing information. Jennifer's family tree showed a Lucy born around 1851 in the Charleston area, enslaved until approximately 1863, then appearing in Freedmen's Bureau records in 1865. The dates aligned. The location matched. The detail about ankle scars from childhood restraints was particularly significant. "My great-great-great-grandmother Lucy never talked much about slavery," Jennifer explained. "But my great-grandmother, Lucy's granddaughter, told us that Lucy had permanent scars around both ankles. She would only say they were from before freedom and wouldn't discuss it further. Lucy was very protective of children, especially girls. She became a teacher after emancipation and dedicated her life to educating formerly enslaved children." Sarah showed Jennifer the enhanced photograph. Jennifer stared at it for a long time, tears streaming down her face as she looked at the young girl standing at the edge of the frame, the thin chain barely visible around her ankle. "That's her," Jennifer said finally. "That's my ancestor. That little girl who tried to run away, who got chained for it, who survived and eventually made it to freedom. She's not just a story anymore. She's real. I can see her face." Sarah and Jennifer worked together over the following months to piece together as much of Lucy's story as possible. They found that Lucy had indeed escaped from the Thornton plantation in 1863 during the chaos of the Civil War when Union forces were operating in the area. She made it to a contraband camp, settlements where escaped slaves found refuge with Union troops, and eventually to Charleston after the war ended. The museum opened its exhibition, Concealed Hidden Truths in Antebellum Photography, in April 2025, exactly 167 years after the Thornton photograph was taken. The Thornton daguerreotype was the centerpiece, displayed with multiple enhancement levels showing how the chain became visible through digital restoration. Beside it hung documentation of Lucy's life, the plantation records, Catherine Thornton's letter, the account book entries documenting skin irritation from restraints, and, most powerfully, photographs from later in Lucy's life. Jennifer had provided images of Lucy from the 1880s and 1890s. Lucy as a teacher, standing with a group of students outside a schoolhouse. Lucy, in her later years, sitting on the porch of her home in Charleston, surrounded by children and grandchildren. In every photograph, Lucy wore long skirts or dresses that covered her ankles completely, even in obvious warm weather. The scars she carried were hidden, but the life she'd built despite them was proudly displayed. The exhibition also included a section on the broader practice of restraining enslaved children, presenting the historical evidence Sarah had compiled alongside contemporary analysis of slavery's psychological and physical trauma. Educational materials helped visitors, especially young people, understand the context without being overwhelmed by the violence depicted. On opening day, Jennifer attended with more than 30 family members, descendants of Lucy spanning 5 generations. They stood together in front of the photograph of 7-year-old Lucy, looking at an ancestor most of them had known only through fragmented stories. The museum had created a special display adjacent to the main exhibition, Lucy's Legacy, documenting her life after slavery, her work as an educator, and her descendants' achievements. Jennifer spoke at the opening ceremony, her voice strong despite obvious emotion. When I first learned that someone had found a photograph of my ancestor Lucy as a child, chained during a family portrait, I didn't know whether I wanted to see it. I knew it would be painful. And it is, looking at that chain around her ankle, knowing she was 7 years old, knowing she'd tried to run away and been punished for wanting freedom. That pain is real and important to acknowledge. But what I also see is survival. I see a child who endured something unimaginable and lived to see freedom, who took the trauma she'd experienced and transformed it into determination that no other child would suffer the way she had, who became a teacher and educated hundreds of formerly enslaved children, who built a family and a life and a legacy that continues today in me and my children and my grandchildren. This photograph doesn't just show violence and cruelty, though it certainly shows that. It also shows that slavery couldn't break us. Lucy wore that chain, but the chain didn't define her. She survived. She escaped. She thrived. And now finally she's visible. Not as property, not as a marginal figure in someone else's portrait, but as a person with a name, a story, and descendants who honor her memory. The exhibition attracted visitors from around the country, many of whom spent extended time examining the enhanced photograph and reading Lucy's story. Teachers brought classes to discuss slavery's impact on children. Genealogists used it as an example of how visual evidence could help families reconstruct histories that enslavement had fragmented. Activists cited it in discussions of historical trauma and contemporary racial justice. Michael continued his work of examining other 19th century photographs for hidden details, part of a growing network of conservators and historians using technology to reveal what historical images had concealed. Several additional discoveries were made. Not all as dramatic as Lucy's chain, but each adding to the accumulated evidence of slavery's daily violence and the many ways it was hidden, normalized, or aestheticized in visual culture. Sarah published a book about Lucy and the photograph, tracing both the specific story of one child's enslavement and survival, and the broader history of how children experienced and resisted slavery. The book included contributions from Jennifer and other descendants, ensuring that Lucy's story was told not just by historians, but by her own family. The photograph that had hidden its secret for 167 years, the chain visible but unseen, waiting for technology and intention to reveal it, now stood as testimony. It proved what had always been true but was too often denied, that slavery's violence extended to the youngest victim, that genteel society was built on brutal foundations, and that the careful compositions of the past often concealed truths that we must now work to uncover and acknowledge. Lucy's chain had been hidden beneath a long dress, obscured by shadows and time, rendered invisible by those who wanted their portrait to show only beauty and prosperity. But the truth emerged eventually, as truth often does, and with it came recognition of Lucy's humanity, suffering, and ultimately her triumph. A little girl who tried to run, who was chained for it, who survived to see freedom, and whose face finally could be seen not as property, but as a person who endured, resisted, and built a legacy that continues generations after that chain was finally broken.